Good morning! Let's talk about filters. Again. This time I want to talk about ND filters a bit more in depth. In the last video, the video prior to this one, I showed you the, in my opinion, 3 essential filters for outdoor photography: polarizing filters, ND filters, and the admittedly quite controversial UV filters. After uploading and the video being up for a bit, I realized that I accidentally left out a short little bit that shows the probably most important reason to use ND filters in photography: long time exposures. So here's the bit that I left out. The probably most common use for ND filters in photography is long time exposure photography, but we need pretty strong ND filters for that to get exposure times of a couple of seconds or maybe even minutes. While editing, I usually shift parts of the video back and forth. Sometimes I park parts outside the actual timeline and I forgot to put it back in. Stupid me. So yeah, but now you saw it. In this video, I will not only talk a bit more in depth about ND filters, I will also show you 3 different types of ND filters and explain the differences so that you can decide which one or which ones you might want to get. My name's Pete, I like pictures. You can find mine on my Instagram, which is tvoomphoto, TVOOM photo in one word, or of course also on my Tumblr, which is simply tvoom, TVOOM.tumblr.com. Let's start. Disclaimer: this video is not sponsored by anyone. Before we dive into the subject, let's first talk about what ND filters are. ND filters are basically shades, sunglasses for our lenses. ND is short for neutral density. An ND filter is neutral because its only effect is reducing the amount of light entering the lens. So there is no color tint, no anything other than reducing the amount of light. Basically, an ND filter is just a dark piece of glass. Why would we even want to restrict light from entering the lens? 2 reasons. In photography, it is mostly to allow us to have longer exposure times, to make motion blur visible. Long time exposure photography is super cool and can give us really impressive photos. Another reason why we sometimes want less light to enter the lens is that we can open the aperture. A wide open aperture means a more shallow depth of field, and that gives us, for example, a blurry background. The wider open the aperture, the smaller the aperture number, the more shallow the depth of field is and the more blurry the background will be. And this is, of course, great for portrait photography in very bright situations when our cameras don't provide a short enough exposure time, or when we want to have a shallow depth of field and a longer exposure time to, for example, have visible motion blur in the photo. There are 3 different types of ND filters. As mentioned, there are regular ND filters in various strengths. The stronger they are, the more they reduce the amount of light. Then there are fader NDs or variable NDs. ND filters with variable strength, and then there are graduated ND filters. They are darker on one side and fade out to become completely clear on the other. They also come in various strengths, as well as in the softness of the gradation. Regular and fader NDs are used in both in photography and in video to allow us to either open up the aperture of the lens to get a more shallow depth of field, or to get longer exposure times than the lighting situation would allow for without an ND filter. Well, or we can have both, right? We can have a very shallow depth of field and a long exposure time or longer exposure time. And this is, of course, very important for video, as all you vloggers and filmmakers know. Because one factor to get what some call the film look or cinematic images, we need to have just the right amount of motion blur in our footage. And to get just the right amount of motion blur, we need to set our shutter speeds to roughly 1/2 the frame rate. So when shooting 24 frames per second, the shutter speed should be set to roughly 1/50 of a second. When we shoot 30 frames per second, shutter speed needs to be at roughly 1/60 of a second. When we shoot 60 frames per second, the shutter speed should be at roughly 1/120 of a second. So you get the notion. Other than regular NDs and fader NDs, graduated ND filters are usually used to even out the exposure of a shot rather than to allow for a more shallow depth of field or a longer exposure time. What do I mean by evening out the exposure? Grad NDs only affect a part of the image, so they are used to darken, for example, a bright sky, so that it doesn't blow out and still shows detail when we expose for the darker parts of the image. Because often when we expose for the sky, so to have detail in the sky, in the clouds, the darker parts of the photo show no details anymore, right? They're just a dark mass. With grad NDs, we can have more evenly exposed images. As you can see, my graduated ND filters are square filters. I can't just screw them on the lens, right, like my other filters. But I have to use a filter holder, or, well, of course I can also hold them directly to the lens if I want to. Graduated NDs not only come as square filters, by the way, but also as round screw-on filters like regular NDs. I personally find the square filters more convenient though, because I can easily slide them into the exact position I need them to be in. Let's face it, grad ND filters have become less and less important over time because, number one, not only have cameras become better and better in dealing with high contrast situations, modern sensors have an incredible dynamic range, but also because, number two, in cases when even modern sensors capabilities don't suffice, we can always use HDR to capture multiple exposures and bring them together later on the computer. And many cameras already have a built-in HDR mode. But, and I will be honest here, using these filters is a lot of fun. It's a very tactile way of photography, and not everyone has the possibility or just simply wants to do a lot or anything at all with their photos later on the computer. Let's move on to fader NDs. Fader or variable NDs are super convenient because we can adjust the strength by simply turning the front element. We can make them darker, therefore stronger, or less dark, therefore less strong. When using regular fixed ND filters, we either have to have a filter of the correct strength ready, or we have to stack filters of various strengths to get the light reduction we need. And that not only means that we need to have different ND filters in different strengths, but also demands calculations, which ones to combine, and that can overall become pretty cumbersome and also quite expensive. Sure, yes, a good fader ND is a bit more expensive than a fixed ND filter, but it's also much more versatile. We only need one and not 2, 3, or 5. So, looking at it all this way, it seems that fader NDs are the better choice compared to regular fixed ND filters, right? Right? No, not always. But I will talk about that, all the pros and the cons of different ND filters in the next video. In the next video, I will also tell you how to make sense of the, at least at first glance, seemingly weird numbers that indicate the strength of NDs. So we will talk about what an ND4 filter is, what an ND8, an ND16, an ND1000 or ND10000 filter is. We will talk about the pros and the cons of stacking filters. I will talk about a really cool alternative to ND filters, and I will show you a super convenient, very quick, very playful way how to make long time exposures with fader NDs. So this one's for today. Stay healthy, stay sexy, stay cool. Bye bye. Till next time. If you liked what you saw, please consider to send this video a thumbs up and maybe subscribe to this channel.